The scent of aged leather and something faintly metallic, like expensive cologne mixed with the tang of a coming storm, always preceded him, a herald of the exquisite, maddening chaos he brought into my meticulously ordered life. I remember the day my world tilted on its axis, the day I, Elara Vance, the ruthlessly efficient chief operating officer of Vance Industries, found myself cornered not by a hostile takeover bid, but by the sheer, unyielding will of Alexander Sterling, CEO of Sterling Global, my gilded cage's new, terrifying master. It wasn't a romance born of whispered secrets under moonlit skies, it was a strategic alliance forged in the sterile glow of boardrooms, cemented by a binding contract that tasted like ash and necessity in my mouth. My father, bless his ailing heart and desperate need to keep the family legacy afloat, had brokered the deal. Vance Industries, facing near collapse, needed Sterling's lifeline, and Alexander, with his predator's gleam in those ice-blue eyes, demanded the ultimate collateral, me. Me, the woman who thrived on control, who organized her life down to the second, who considered spontaneity a sign of intellectual laziness. He didn't court me, he annexed me. The wedding was a spectacle of forced smiles and mutual distaste, mine sharp and genuine, his a polished, almost bored veneer of ownership. And then, the real siege began. He moved me into his penthouse, a monument to minimalist wealth perched atop the city, all glass and cold marble where the wind howled like a banshee in the high altitudes, and declared his intentions with the casual cruelty of a bored god. Elara, he'd draw out my name, the sound sliding over my nerves like silk soaked in ammonia. You belong to me now. Your competence is appreciated in the office, but here, in this cage, you are simply Mrs. Sterling. And Mrs. Sterling exists to amuse me. Amuse him. That was the mandate. And amuse him he did, by dismantling my boundaries piece by piece, not with brute force, but with insidious, calculated psychological warfare that left me simultaneously furious and strangely breathless. He knew exactly where to prod, how to apply pressure until I snapped, only to pull back just before the real break. The teasing started subtly, almost paternally, which only made it worse. If I wore a severe, charcoal power suit to our obligatory evening dinners, which were more like audits of my new domestic situation, he would compliment the cut, then spend the rest of the meal subtly finding fault with the way I held my wine glass, or the overly formal structure of my answers. "Are you always this brittle, Elara?" he'd ask, leaning back, perfectly relaxed, while I sat bolt upright, feeling like a poorly strung marionette. "Relax. You look like you're about to deliver bad quarterly reports." Then came the wardrobe inspections. I prided myself on my professional, unembellished aesthetic. Alexander, however, seemed to possess an internal radar for anything that didn't scream expensive object dar. One evening, I descended the sweeping staircase in a simple, yet impeccably tailored black sheath dress. He stopped mid-sip of his single malt, his gaze lingering a beat too long, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Charming, Elara," he purred, walking towards me, his shadow swallowing mine. "But entirely too functional. Do you dress for yourself, or for the shareholders?" He reached out, his thumb brushing the delicate silver chain at my throat, the only piece of jewelry I allowed myself. "From now on, you dress for my approval. And frankly, tonight's effort earns you a C-. The next day, an entire wardrobe arrived, shipped from Paris in unmarked crates. Silks that clung like a second skin, dresses that required a confidence I didn't know I possessed, and shoes that demanded a new posture. When I tried to send them back, citing the absurdity of it all, his assistant, a woman named Serena whose efficiency bordered on unnerving, simply presented me with a signed note from Alexander: "Wear them, or I'll personally choose your office attire for the entire fiscal year." The thought of him selecting my professional wardrobe, something deeply personal to my sense of self, was enough to make me yield. The torment was subtle, pervasive, woven into the fabric of our forced cohabitation. He'd rearranged the furniture in my study, the one sanctuary I'd carved out, shifting my carefully catalogued files by millimeters, just enough to throw off my spatial memory. I'd spend hours hunting for the misplaced profitability analysis, only to find him lounging on the bespoke sofa, pretending to read a financial journal, while my documents were stacked neatly, but utterly wrong, on his coffee table. "Losing things, Elara," He'd inquire sweetly, not even looking up. Perhaps you're too stressed. Stress affects memory, you know. A good distraction might help clear the fog. The distractions were his specialty. He would wait until I was on a critical conference call, headset tight against my temples, dealing with some crisis born from my father's poor management, and then he would appear, leaning against the doorframe, radiating boredom. He wouldn't speak, just watch. His eyes, those relentless chips of Arctic ice, would track my every gesture, the way my jaw tightened, the tremor in my hand as I tapped the pen. It was psychological water torture. I'd start rambling, my focus shattering, unable to deliver the precise, articulate analysis my position demanded. "Mr. Sterling, please," I'd hiss into the phone after hanging up in frustration, clutching the receiver until my knuckles were white. "I am working." He'd push off the doorframe, stepping into the room, invading the space that was supposed to be mine. "And I am observing, Mrs. Sterling. Observation is vital for understanding your current stress levels. Tell me, Elara, when was the last time you allowed yourself a genuine release?" I never answered, of course. I would turn away, my back rigid, but I could feel the heat of his proximity, the silent challenge hanging between us like a live wire. He was testing my limits, pushing me toward an emotional breakdown, seeking the moment where the COO facade cracked to reveal the woman underneath, a woman he hadn't bothered to define, only to possess. The dinners became a performance art directed by him. If I ate too quickly, I was rushed and grasping. If I ate too slowly, I was pretending to be fragile. He delighted in ordering dishes known to be rich or complicated, watching with detached amusement as I navigated the etiquette, always careful never to stain my expensive clothes or drop so much as a single grain of rice. One night, he ordered something involving rare shellfish. I, having impeccable knowledge of food safety from years of maintaining peak executive health, politely declined. "Allergic?" he asked, his brow furrowing in mock concern. "No, simply not hungry for seafood tonight, Alexander." He waved the waiter over with an almost imperceptible flick of his wrist. "Cancel the appetizer. Bring Mrs. Sterling the entire plate of oysters. And a side of Tabasco. She needs to learn to be less predictable, don't you think?" I stared at the plate of glistening, slimy shells when they arrived, a wave of nausea hitting me. Refusing was not an option. Refusing meant a public scene, which played directly into his hands. So, I ate them. One by one. The texture was revolting, the flavor overwhelmingly briny, but I chewed, swallowed, and maintained eye contact with him, determined to show no weakness. When I finished the last one, I dabbed my lips with the linen napkin, perfectly composed. He didn't applaud. He didn't even smile. He simply nodded once, a flicker of something sharp and undeniably satisfied passing through his eyes. "Good girl. You learn quickly when the stakes are high." That was the turning point, though I didn't recognize it then. He hadn't just forced me to eat, he'd forced me to obey a bizarre, arbitrary command, and I had done it to maintain control over my reaction. He hadn't just won that small battle, he had subtly introduced the concept of my compliance being something he desired. The teasing escalated into physical proximity that felt less like intimacy and more like territorial marking. He'd lean over my shoulder while I reviewed documents on my tablet, his breath stirring the fine hairs at my nape. I would freeze, my muscles locking down, trying to concentrate on EBITDA margins while my entire nervous system screamed a silent alarm. "That projection is too conservative, Elara," he'd murmur, pointing a long, elegant finger at the screen. His hand would rest momentarily on my shoulder, a dead weight, claiming ownership. I started developing rituals to cope. I would leave the office precisely at 6 p.m., clocking out with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker, hoping that a strict adherence to schedule would somehow shield me from his intrusions. I'd race home, planning to barricade myself in my room with work, only to find a note on my pillow, handwritten in his impossibly sharp script, waiting downstairs. "Don't keep the entertainment waiting." Their entertainment was usually something designed to force physical awareness. Sometimes it was a forced slow dance in the middle of the cavernous living room to obscure, classical music, where he held me too tightly, too close, making me acutely aware of the expanse of his chest beneath his tuxedo shirt. "You hold yourself like you're afraid of shattering, Elara," he'd whisper, his voice low, vibrating through my ribs. "Let go." I couldn't. Letting go meant accepting the chaos he represented, accepting that my life was no longer my own navigation. One evening, perhaps driven by sheer, unadulterated frustration, I decided to fight back on his turf. I came home early from a trip to Tokyo, surprising him. I found him not at work, but in the private home gym, shirtless, veins prominent as he lifted punishing weights, sweat gleaming on his sculpted body under the harsh track lighting. He looked less like a CEO and more like a sculpture carved from granite and pure ambition. He paused his set, breathing heavily, and looked at me, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "What are you doing here, Vance?" I decided to inject a little unpredictability into the equation. "Alexander," I said, walking confidently onto the specialized matting, my own silk blouse suddenly feeling flimsy. I walked over to the heavy bag hanging in the corner, one I hadn't touched since college wrestling days. I laced up the gloves he kept there, purely for show, I assumed. "Don't be ridiculous," he scoffed, tossing the barbell aside with an easy clank. "You'll break a nail." I ignored him. I started slow, hitting the bag with stiff, controlled jabs, my technique rusty but present. I focused the entirety of my trapped rage, my professional anxieties, and the suffocating weight of his scrutiny into those leather-encased fists. Thwack, thwack, thwack. He watched for perhaps 60 seconds, a slight smirk playing on his lips. Then, he moved. He didn't intercept me, he simply moved behind me. His hands covered mine, wrapping around the bag gloves, instantly correcting my stance. His body pressed against my back, a solid, immovable wall of heat and muscle. "Your core is slack," he breathed into my ear, the proximity so startling it nearly made me drop my guard. "Tighter. You're fighting the bag, not generating power." His fingers guided my fists, forcing me to rotate my hips, to engage muscles I'd forgotten existed. The rhythm changed. It was no longer a frustrated pounding, it became an economical exchange of force. He guided me through combinations, jab, cross, hook, his voice a low, mesmerizing instruction manual pressed against my ear. Again. "Feel the connection. Don't just hit it, drive through it." For 10 minutes, we were a single unit, moving in practiced synchronization born from pure physical exertion. My arms burned, my breath hitched, and for the first time in months, the tension that usually coiled in my shoulders began to unravel. When we finally stopped, I leaned against the heavy bag, utterly spent, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. He stepped back, his chest still rising and falling rapidly. He looked down at me, not with condescension, but with an expression I couldn't decipher, intense, focused, almost proprietary. "See, Elara," he said, his voice rougher now. "You have strength. You just need someone strong enough to force you to use it correctly." I wanted to snarl, to tell him he had no right, but the exertion had left me too breathless for defiance. I merely nodded, pulling off the gloves, my hands stinging. That was the first time the teasing crossed a line into something else entirely. He hadn't just teased me, he had trained me. He had taken my anger and channeled it into a physical outlet, and in doing so, he had created a dependency I hadn't anticipated. The next day, he didn't mention the gym. Instead, he sent me a series of encrypted emails, each containing an obscure, complex logistical problem that required more than just spreadsheet knowledge, it required lateral, almost artistic problem-solving. He was giving me intellectual puzzles designed to frustrate me, to make me sweat over the data until I craved the clarity he might offer. And I craved it. I spent 2 days submerged, fueled by black coffee and sheer pride, trying to crack the final algorithm in the third email. When I finally found the solution, an elegant, highly unconventional workaround, I didn't call Serena or the IT department. I walked directly to Alexander's office, heart pounding with the anticipation of praise. He was on a video conference, gesturing emphatically. I stood by the door, waiting. He finished his call, a lingering, dismissive wave to the screen, and then turned to me, his expression one of mild inquiry. "Yes, Elara?" Did you manage to solve the minor puzzle I set for you? I placed the printed solution on his desk, aligning it perfectly with the edge of his mahogany blotter. It's done. The solution requires bypassing the standard third-party verification protocol through a staggered data shunt, which cuts processing time by 22%. He didn't even glance at the paper immediately. He steepled his fingers, leaning back again, that infuriatingly calm CEO posture. 22%, he mused. Predictable. You took the obvious route, which is often the safest, but rarely the most interesting. The air rushed out of me. All those sleepless hours, the mental battle, reduced to predictable. The obvious route is the soundest route, Alexander. It maintains structural integrity, I retorted, my voice tight. He finally picked up the paper, scanning it with impossible speed. He circled one section with a red pen he produced from nowhere. Here. This shunt relies on a temporary exploit in the firewall. Clever, yes. But what happens when that exploit is patched next Tuesday? Your 22% gain evaporates, and you have a security nightmare on your hands. He tapped the spot. I wasn't teasing you with the problem, Elara. I was testing your foresight. You see the immediate gain, but you fail to secure the long-term vulnerability. You are too focused on the now. He pushed the paper back to me. Go back. Fix it. And perhaps, he added, leaning forward, his voice dropping to that dangerous conspiratorial register, if you manage to secure the long-term solution, I might reward your diligence. The word reward hung in the air, thick with unspoken implication. He wasn't teasing me about spreadsheets anymore, he was teasing me about my reaction to his criticism. He had successfully goaded me into needing his approval for my professional efficacy. I retreated, fueled by wounded pride. I worked all night, redesigning the entire protocol, weaving redundancy into the shunt, creating something robust that he couldn't possibly criticize. By dawn, I had it. I marched into his office precisely when he arrived, my posture radiating cold fury and professional victory. He looked slightly surprised to see me before his usual mask of aloof control settled back into place. You look terrible, Elara. Another sleepless night worrying about my proprietary data? I fixed it, I said, sliding the reinforced design across his desk. It addresses the long-term vulnerability. No exploits. 99.9% uptime guaranteed for the next 5 years. He examined it, this time slowly, deliberately. He made no notes. He didn't circle anything. He just absorbed the data. Finally, he leaned back, a genuine, albeit small, smile touching the corners of his mouth. It was a smile that held admiration, something rare and unnerving. Impressive, he conceded. You didn't just solve the equation, you anticipated the consequences. You stopped fighting the parameters and started mastering the system. He stood up, circling the desk toward me. I braced myself for the standard verbal pat on the head. Instead, he stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I could smell the faint, smoky scent of his morning espresso mingling with his cologne. You earned this, Elara, he said, his voice low. He reached out, not to touch my face or my shoulder, but to gently, almost ceremoniously, straighten the lapel of my blazer, a garment that had become a symbol of my former professional armor. His fingers lingered on the fabric, tracing the seam. Now, about that reward. My heart did something erratic. All the weeks of intellectual sparring, the forced proximity, the deliberate boundary violations, they had all been conditioning. He hadn't been trying to drive me away, he had been trying to break down the fortress so he could explore the terrain inside. What reward, Alexander? I managed, my voice barely a breathy whisper, suddenly hyper-aware of the crisp silk of my blouse against my skin. He tilted his head, his icy eyes boring into mine, no longer teasing, but deeply assessing. The reward for excellent work is often a period of mandated rest. You need to stop being so tense, Elara. You need to learn how to relax under pressure, without resorting to rigid control. He didn't touch me, not yet. He simply held my gaze, and the air thickened with unspoken expectation. This wasn't a threat, it was an invitation laced with absolute command. Your office schedule is cleared for the next 48 hours, he stated, his tone brooking no argument. You will not check emails. You will not review reports. You will stay here. With me. And that was how the true game began. He had stopped teasing the CEO and started systematically dismantling the woman, convinced he was training a superior asset. But he had miscalculated the nature of my resilience. I was designed to withstand pressure. I just hadn't realized that pressure could be applied in ways other than professional strain. The first day of mandated rest felt like being locked in a gilded cage with the lion. He didn't shout or demand physical affection, he just curated an environment where my usual coping mechanisms were useless. He took me on a tour of the penthouse, which I'd previously only seen as a backdrop for necessary appearances. He showed me his private library, volumes bound in rich leather, first editions, everything immaculate. Your sanctuary, he announced, indicating a plush armchair near the fireplace. Sit. I sat, cautiously. He didn't sit near me. Instead, he went to a discreet cabinet and brought out 2 small, antique silver cups and a bottle of clear liquid. Sake, he said, pouring precisely measured amounts. A rare vintage from a tiny brewery in Kyoto. You'll appreciate the precision required to produce this. He was appealing to my appreciation for quality control, my COO sensibilities. He was speaking my language, but using it to disarm me. We drank the sake, slowly. He didn't talk about business. He asked about my childhood, about the specific, rigorous training regimen I'd undergone at Vance Industries to ensure my ascent. He listened, truly listened, with an unnerving intensity, not to connect, but to map my vulnerabilities. So, you were taught that emotion is inefficiency, he summarized, swirling the delicate liquid in his cup. That vulnerability is weakness. Who taught you that toxic philosophy, Elara? My predecessors. The market demands clarity, not sentimentality. The market demands ruthlessness, he corrected sharply. But ruthlessness divorced from understanding is just noise. You've suppressed your instincts so thoroughly that you react to any deviation from plan with panic. That's why the first solution you presented was flawed. You feared deviation, so you clung to the simplest fix. It was a masterful diagnosis, delivered with the calm precision of a surgeon. It stung because it was true. He had reduced my entire defense mechanism to a predictable flaw. He continued the subtle torture. He guided me through an elaborate, multi-course lunch, insisting I eat every portion, making me slow down my consumption until the simple act of chewing became a deliberate, observed task. He narrated the origin of every ingredient, forcing me to focus intensely on the mundane, robbing me of the mental space to plot my escape. By late afternoon, I was feeling strangely subdued, not angry, but disoriented. My usual mental armor felt thin. Now, he said, standing over me as I stared into the fireplace. We need to address that physical tension you carry. I tensed immediately. I don't need a massage, Alexander. I'm fine. Indeed, you are functional. But you are not optimized. He snapped his fingers. Serena appeared instantly, silently placing a set of heavy, supple leather straps on the side table. My breath hitched. This felt like a deliberate step too far, a crossing of the line into something I hadn't prepared for. What is this? I asked, my voice tight. Alexander looked at the straps with the same detached interest he reserved for a complex stock report. These are tactile stimulators. I read your personnel file. You took advanced wilderness survival courses in your 20s. You have a high tolerance for physical discomfort, provided it serves a clear, achievable goal. He picked up a strap, testing its weight. Your issue, Elara, is that you constantly resist outside stimulus that you haven't vetted. I intend to force you to process stimulus without your usual intellectual filter. You will learn to experience sensation without immediately categorizing it as either a threat or an opportunity. He approached me, and I instinctively leaned back, hitting the back of the plush chair. I won't be restrained, I stated, trying to infuse the words with the authority I usually wielded in the boardroom. He actually laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. You mistake your current circumstances for a negotiation, Elara. You are not in a position to veto the methods required for your reward, which, incidentally, is learning how to feel something other than calculated control. He didn't force me. He simply stood there, radiating immutable authority, holding the strap. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire. I looked at the straps, then at his face. He looked utterly unbothered, certain of my eventual capitulation. And then, the realization hit me. He was enjoying this. He was deriving genuine satisfaction from my helplessness, from forcing me into a position where my formidable intellect was useless. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was trying to break my composure and then rebuild me into something more pliable. He was teasing the very core of my identity, the unflappable COO. Slowly, deliberately, I reached out and took the strap from his hand. The leather was smooth, warm from his grip. "Do it," I whispered, hating the sudden dryness in my throat. "If this is the necessary path to optimization." He didn't look triumphant. He looked thoughtful. Good. Cooperation simplifies the process. He had me sit on the floor before the hearth, positioning my wrists carefully. He bound them not brutally tight, but firmly enough to render my hands useless, symbolic anchors grounding me to the spot. The sensation was immediately alien. My hands, my primary tools, were suddenly foreign objects, unable to move, unable to grasp. He didn't touch me again immediately. He simply walked over to the bar, poured another round of sake, and sat in a high-backed chair a few feet away, observing my mounting discomfort. "Tell me what you feel, Elara. Not what you think. What do you feel?" Panic clawed at the edges of my vision. My mind screamed for the spreadsheet, for a deadline, for anything to anchor to. "I feel constrained. My movement is restricted. It's inefficient." "Inefficient. Or unavoidable," he countered. "You are forced to rely on senses other than touch and motion. Use your hearing. Smell. Focus on the heat of the fire." I tried. I focused on the scent of the burning oak, the sound of the ice shifting in his glass. It was maddening. My skin felt too tight. He took his time. He let me stew in the sensation of helplessness for what felt like an eternity. Then, he stood up and approached me. He didn't use his hands this time. He leaned down, pressing his strong, warm thigh against my hip, grounding me further. "You are so reliant on controlling the narrative, Elara," he murmured. "But sometimes, the most profound realization comes when you are forced to simply endure the moment." He then began to use a feather, a ludicrously soft, white feather, to trace the contours of my face, moving from my temple, down the line of my jaw, pausing at my lips. The contrast between the iron grip of the bindings and the almost weightless touch of the feather was excruciating. It was so delicate, so non-threatening, yet utterly invasive because I couldn't bat it away. My composure began to fray. A strange, unwanted heat pooled low in my stomach. It wasn't fear, it was a profound, humiliating lack of control directed by a man whose only previous goal was to annoy me. "Alexander, stop this," I managed, my voice husky. "Why?" he asked, lifting the feather away only to replace it with the sensation of his own warm breath against my ear. "Am I teasing you, Elara? Or am I finally getting your attention outside the parameters of a merger agreement?" He didn't wait for an answer. He simply continued the slow, maddening exploration of sensation, using textures, temperature, and proximity to unravel the tightly wound CEO. He made me feel things I hadn't allowed myself to feel since childhood: vulnerability, anticipation, and a deep, unsettling need for the contact to continue. When he finally released the bindings, it was nearly dark outside, my wrists were red, but more importantly, my mind was reeling. I didn't jump up to flee. I sat there, processing the aftermath of being utterly passive. He helped me stand. I felt unsteady, like a newborn foal. "See," he said, his tone professional again, though his eyes held a residual intensity. "The moment you stop fighting the stimulus, you begin to process it. Now, you're ready for dinner." Dinner was surprisingly normal, a light broth, fresh bread. But the dynamic had shifted. He had demonstrated that he could dismantle my defenses not through brute force, which I could resist, but through controlled, psychological intrusion, which I couldn't easily categorize or combat. The teasing continued, but it changed its nature. It morphed from petty annoyances into directed, deliberate provocations aimed at eliciting specific, uncontrolled responses. If I expressed a strong opinion on global politics, he wouldn't argue facts, he would simply raise an eyebrow and say, "Such passion, Elara. It's wasted on mere policy. You should reserve that fire for something truly worth the effort." He was acknowledging the depth beneath the surface I presented. If I tried to regain control by organizing his chaotic desk during a momentary absence, I'd return to find that he had deliberately misplaced the one document I needed most urgently, and then, when I finally located it hidden under a stack of magazines, I'd find a note tucked inside. "Good attempt at asserting dominance, but you'll never beat me at my own game." He wasn't just teasing me, he was playing a sophisticated game of emotional chess, always forcing me to make the next move, knowing that any move I made was colored by the tension he had created. One afternoon, I found myself alone in the main gallery, staring at a truly hideous, overly ornate sculpture he insisted on keeping. I was alone, exhausted from a week of intense negotiations that he'd made sure I handled solo, a calculated stress test. I leaned against the wall, closing my eyes, just wanting silence. The door hissed open, and I assumed it was the cleaning crew. I didn't move. Then, I heard the distinct sound of a zipper. I opened my eyes just in time to see Alexander slide his hands inside his impeccably tailored trousers, briefly adjusting his posture. He caught my eye mid-action, paused for a beat, and then finished the adjustment with a deliberate, almost languid motion, meeting my gaze without flinching. He didn't offer an explanation, didn't blush, didn't even look embarrassed. He merely walked past me, picked up a crystal decanter, and poured himself a glass of water. Distracted, he asked casually, taking a sip. I was trembling. It was the most blatant, unapologetic display of casual dominance I had ever witnessed. It was a deliberate, jarring injection of raw physicality into my sterile environment. He had shown me that even in this rarefied air, he was governed only by his own impulses. You have no sense of professional boundaries," I managed, appalled. He turned, leaning against the doorway, completely at ease. "Boundaries are for those who fear what lies beyond them, Elara. You, however, are supposed to be learning to embrace necessary stimulation." I was demonstrating that even the most composed exterior conceals fundamental needs. He walked toward me, slowly closing the gap I'd created by leaning against the wall. "Did it disrupt your composure?" he pressed, his voice low, challenging. I swallowed hard. I couldn't lie. The shock had been effective. "Yes." "Good," he breathed, reaching out to brush a stray strand of hair from my cheek. This time, the touch was deliberate, warm, and surprisingly gentle. Because if you can handle that level of unexpected intrusion without collapsing, you can handle anything the market throws at you. This was the insidious part. He was framing his control as mentorship. He was making me believe that enduring his psychological torment was somehow beneficial to my career, which in turn benefited my family's company. My hatred for him began to curdle into a perverse form of respect, and then, something much more dangerous, anticipation. I started looking forward to his intrusions. I found myself scrutinizing my outfits, subconsciously dressing in ways that might draw his attention, just to see what bizarre, unnerving compliment or criticism he would offer. If I wore a slightly lower neckline, he wouldn't comment on my body, but on my choice of necklace. "That pendant is too simple, Elara. It suggests you are satisfied with the status quo. Sterling Global is never satisfied." If I wore something conservative, he'd eye it critically. "Are you trying to hide, Vance? We both know what you're capable of. Don't let a sheath of wool convince you otherwise." He was constantly poking, testing the seams of my self-perception. He wanted me off balance, and infuriatingly, I was becoming better at functioning while off balance. Then came the art theft. I came home one evening to find the enormous, abstract Rothko reproduction that hung in the main hallway, a piece I detested for its chaotic energy, gone. In its place was a small, framed Renaissance sketch of a woman in quiet contemplation. I found Alexander in the study, working late, the lights dimmed. "Where is the Rothko?" I demanded, bypassing all pleasantries. He didn't look up from his screen. It was visually exhausting. I replaced it with something more calming. "Calming? Alexander, that piece was appraised at 7 figures. You can't just swap art on a whim." He finally swiveled his chair around, a thin, amused smile on his face. "Ah, the fiscal distress is kicking in. Don't worry, Elara. I didn't sell it. I merely relocated it." "Relocated it where?" "Somewhere less visible," he drawled. He stood up, stretching leisurely. "I needed to test your reaction to sudden, unexplained scarcity of expected value. When you see something valuable disappear, do you panic about the loss, or do you focus on recovering the asset?" He led me down a rarely used corridor to a small, utilitarian storage room usually reserved for off-season decorations. He flicked on the harsh overhead light. There, leaning against a dusty box of Christmas ornaments, was the Rothko, unharmed. "See," he said, gesturing grandly. "It was never truly gone. You just assumed the worst. You assumed I was trying to diminish your assets, rather than simply rearrange the environment to see how you would react." He walked up to the painting, running a proprietary finger over the canvas edge. Then, he turned back to me, his expression shifting into something much darker, much more intimate. "You see, Elara, everything in this apartment, in this marriage, belongs to me. But I enjoy watching you try to reclaim pieces of it, even temporarily. That struggle, that futile, predictable desire to exert control over what is definitively mine, that's what entertains me." He stepped very close. "And I suspect, secretly, it's starting to entertain you too." My breath caught. He had articulated the horrifying truth. I hated being controlled, yet the constant pressure, the constant need to anticipate his next calculated move, had turned my life into a high-stakes game where the only prize was a fleeting moment of psychological reprieve or his reluctant acknowledgement. "You enjoy watching me fight, Alexander," I whispered. "I enjoy watching you react," he corrected. "Fighting is predictable. Reaction is where the truth of your programming lies. And this is where the dynamic truly flipped. I had been expecting him to tease me into submission, forcing me into a predictable, emotional response he could label and dismiss. But by consistently pushing me to the edge of my control, he had inadvertently shown me the exhilarating feeling of being truly alive under pressure. I started to experiment. If he made a dismissive comment about my competence, I didn't argue professionally. I'd meet his gaze, smile faintly, and say something utterly irrelevant but slightly suggestive, delivered in a tone that implied I knew exactly what he was thinking. "Perhaps," I'd say, looking him up and down, "I need a more robust stress test than just quarterly earnings." He'd pause, thrown off his stride. He was prepared for intellectual defense or emotional outburst. He was not prepared for weaponized, calculated flirtation masked as boardroom bravado. One night, he'd set up an absurd scenario, a formal dinner for two, catered by a Michelin-starred chef, but we were required to eat while standing at opposite ends of the immense dining table, communicating only through shouted commands to the waiter. It was designed to frustrate my need for civilized interaction. I played along perfectly for the first 2 courses, shouting for more water, criticizing the temperature of the consommé with excessive formality. Then, during the fish course, I stopped shouting. I looked at the exquisite plate before me, took a deliberate bite, and then, without breaking eye contact with him across the 50-foot expanse of polished wood, I used my fingers to gently, deliberately, smear a dollop of sauce directly onto my own cheekbone. Alexander froze, the fork halfway to his mouth. He stared at the streak of saffron reduction marring my pristine composure. I slowly raised my hand, not to wipe it off, but to slowly trace the line of the sauce with my fingertip, then bring that finger to my own lips, licking it clean with unnerving slowness. The teasing stopped. The control fractured. He dropped his fork. The sound echoed in the vast room. "Elara," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, all arrogance stripped away. "Yes, Alexander," I returned, my voice steady, but vibrating with a tension he himself had manufactured. "Am I being unpredictable now? Or am I simply responding to the environment you created?" He walked around the table, not with predatory grace, but with a sudden, urgent stride. He reached me, grabbing my wrist, the first time he'd touched me in anger or excitement, rather than calculated maneuver. "You're playing a very dangerous game, Mrs. Sterling," he ground out, pulling me against him. "Am I?" I challenged, looking up at him, feeling the sudden, dizzying rush of having finally forced him off his perfectly manicured path. "Or have you finally teased the result you desired?" He didn't answer with words. He didn't need to. The ice in his eyes had thawed, replaced by a molten intensity that mirrored the heat I'd been cultivating for weeks. He hadn't broken me, he had simply taught me a new, more effective set of tools, and now I was using them on him. The hunter had become the hunted, not through an external force, but through the internal combustion he had so meticulously ignited. He had forced me to pay attention to sensation, to break routine, to seek release from the suffocating control of my own making. And in doing so, he had made himself the object of my focus, the key to my own newfound, chaotic liberation. From that moment on, our dynamic inverted. The power games didn't cease, they just shifted targets. When he tried to give me an arbitrary, demanding task, like redesigning a marketing campaign in 3 hours, I wouldn't struggle or comply silently. I'd look him dead in the eye, a slow, challenging smile spreading across my face, and say, "That sounds exhausting, Alexander. Perhaps if you were feeling stressed, I could devise a more effective decompression strategy for you first." He would flinch, a genuine, almost panicked reaction. He was addicted to the control, but I had discovered the mechanism of his addiction, the need to see my calculated composure shatter. Now, I controlled the shattering. If he tried to impose his will on my schedule, I'd respond by completely abandoning my own work and focusing solely on something utterly trivial but time-consuming, like reorganizing his vast collection of antique maps by latitude, making sure he couldn't reach me for consultation. "Elara, I need the APAC projections," he'd bark over the secure line. "Sorry, Alexander," I'd call back, my voice cheerful and maddeningly unconcerned. "I'm entirely preoccupied with the comparative cartography of 17th century maritime routes. It requires absolute focus. Perhaps you could analyze the projections yourself? Unless you're finding yourself incapable of functioning without my assistance." He hated that. He hated being rendered inert, even for an hour. The CEO who delighted in keeping me on edge now found himself pacing his pristine office, desperate for me to return to the predictable role of the tightly wound COO he could prod. The teasing became mutual, a relentless escalation of psychological warfare where the stakes were no longer my professional life, but his emotional equilibrium. If he tried to maintain physical distance, insisting on separate wings of the penthouse during the day, I'd find ways to invade his space in non-threatening, yet deeply disorienting ways. I started showing up at his office just as he was about to settle in for a meeting, not with documents, but with a single, perfect glass of water, perfectly chilled, placed silently on his desk. I'd meet his furious gaze with a serene expression, offer a slight nod, and walk away without a word. He'd be left staring at the glass, the silent offering of service disrupting the structure of his day more profoundly than any argument. The most effective weapon, however, was turning his own tactics against him. He loved observing me when I was working intensely. So, I started observing him. I learned his rhythms, the exact moment he reached for his afternoon espresso, the subtle way his jaw clenched when a trade went sour, the almost imperceptible tick in his left eye when he was lying. One evening, he was regaling a business associate over dinner about a particularly brutal negotiation he'd just won, leaning back, radiating victory. I sat next to him, looking perfectly demure in a gown he'd selected, sipping champagne. As he paused for dramatic effect, ready to deliver his concluding punchline, I leaned in close to his ear, my voice a near-silent rasp only he could hear over the clinking cutlery. "Your tie is crooked, Alexander," I whispered. "And you're sweating near your hairline. You look desperate to prove yourself." His face went pale. He stammered, lost his thread, and the entire narrative of his dominance collapsed in front of his guest. He recovered quickly, forcing a laugh, but I saw the flicker of raw panic. I had exposed the insecurity beneath the armor, the need for external validation that I'd once shared. The aftermath was immediate and volatile. Back in the penthouse, he cornered me in the hallway, his controlled fury finally erupting into something raw. "You humiliated me," he snarled, gripping my arms. "No, Alexander," I corrected, meeting his intense gaze, not flinching from the proximity that used to paralyze me. "I merely pointed out the structural vulnerabilities in your performance. You taught me to look for the weakness, remember? I'm just applying the principle to the executive team." I leaned into his grip, an act of calculated surrender that was actually a supreme assertion of power. "You spent months teasing me, pushing me, demanding perfection under stress. I learned. And now, I'm merely demanding the same adherence to form from you. You can't fault me for utilizing the methodology you championed." He stared at me, his breath ragged. All the weeks of calculated psychological manipulation, the subtle boundary violations, the forced intimacy, had been designed to break me. Instead, they had honed me into a perfect counterpoint. He had, in effect, rigorously trained his own adversary. The air between us was thick, no longer with tension born of forced marriage, but with the charged recognition of two equals locked in a high-stakes battle for dominance, a battle where the lines between hostility and desire had completely blurred. He released me so abruptly I nearly stumbled. He ran a hand through his perfectly structured dark hair, messing it up in a way I had never seen before, a genuine sign of disarray. "You are infuriating, Elara Vance Sterling," he admitted, the use of my full name sounding like a curse and a compliment rolled into one. "And you," I countered, taking a step closer, my previous fear replaced by a driving, exhilarating need to see him truly unravel. "You are predictable in your need for control. You tease because you fear chaos, yet you create it to feel alive. I see the pattern now." I reached out, my hand hovering near his chest, the place where I'd felt his heart hammering during our gym session weeks ago. I didn't touch him yet. I just held my hand there, letting him feel the possibility of contact, the promise of a different kind of interaction. "You taught me to look beyond the surface, Alexander," I murmured, my voice now mirroring the low, commanding tone he used to employ. "And the surface is boring. I prefer the deep structure." He closed his eyes for a brief second, a flicker of surrender crossing his face that was more intoxicating than any formal praise. He opened them, and the coldness was gone, replaced by a dangerous, undeniable fire that matched my own. "Then stop teasing me, Elara," he commanded, his voice suddenly rough, completely devoid of boardroom polish. "Stop analyzing and start acting." And that, I realized with a profound, unsettling sense of realization, was the final, devastating irony. The man who had spent months trying to break my composure through ceaseless torment, the CEO who thought he could tease a perfectly controlled woman into submission, was now begging me to take the reins. He had broken my old control, only to find he was addicted to the potent, unpredictable energy of my new, weaponized response. He hadn't broken me, he had simply cured me of my own rigidity, creating a dependency on the very friction that now bound us. I finally let my fingers rest against the crisp fabric over his heart, no longer trying to fix his posture, but simply feeling the frantic rhythm he could no longer hide. The game of teasing was over. The game of addiction, born from that precise, relentless pressure, had only just begun, and for the first time since the contract was signed, I felt utterly in control of the entire Sterling global empire, starting with its very demanding CEO. I had been pushed to the brink by his torment, only to discover that the only thing I truly craved was the continuing, electrifying struggle against him. He teased me, and now, I was utterly, irrevocably hooked on the high of tearing down his walls.